Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Beethoven Matters under the auspices of Garsington Opera and the Royal Philharmonic Society, and brought to you direct from our own various different locations through the wonders of technology. This summer, Garsington Opera had planned to stage Fidelio, Beethoven's only opera, a work that is all about freedom, humanity, and love. The Royal Philharmonic Society, meanwhile, had a very special association with Beethoven. Namely, it commissioned his Symphony No. 9, complete with the Ode to Joy. And it's simply impossible to think of the world today, both musical and beyond it, without that work. This talk was originally going to celebrate both the new production and the 250th anniversary of Beethoven's birth, amid a plethora of celebratory events the world over. Instead, of course, we're a bit lonely, but at least we can go online. I'm Jessica Duchen, music critic and writer. I'm working on a Beethoven novel at the moment and some youth opera librettos for Garsington. I'm delighted to be introducing tonight's discussion with four extremely dynamic musicians. Together, we'll be looking at why Beethoven matters to us now more than ever. And not only because it's his big birthday. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be bringing different perspectives to the issues of Beethoven as musician, as human being, and as the leaver of a legacy that is still influencing composers here in the 21st century. We're also expecting to have some music from two of our panelists, and then there'll be time for audience questions. So wherever you are in the world, and whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, you can join in by leaving a question in the comments boxes at any point, and we'll come to them at the end. So let's meet the panel. Dougie Boyd is a distinguished conductor and artistic director of Garsington Opera. David Owen Norris, pianist and academic extraordinaire, illuminates the music world as performer, lecturer, and broadcaster. Toby Spence is one of Britain's leading tenors, and he was going to sing the role of Florist in Garsington's production of Fidelio. And Freya Waley-Cohen is a fast-rising composer, recently featured composer at the Wigmore Hall, and she's been inspired by some of Beethoven's most notoriously complex late music. Good evening to everybody.
Nice to be here.
Welcome. So let's dive straight in with Beethoven, the musician. And Dougie, if we can start with you, what is it like to conduct Beethoven's music? And especially perhaps something like the Eroica Symphony, which it was actually the most groundbreaking of them all and remained Beethoven's favorite for, I think, the rest of his life. How does it feel?
Wow. Well, conducting Eroica is like the most incredible drug, I would say. Not that I have any experience, but it is an extraordinary experience. I think the Eroica is amazing because it's groundbreaking in symphonic terms. And not only is it the longest symphony that was ever composed up until that point, but I think it's a symphony that expresses every emotion that a human being is capable of expressing. And sometimes we think of classical music as relaxing or something that we have on to soothe, but actually Beethoven, he challenges, and he is able to express in this symphony, yes, triumph and joy and love sometimes, but also grief and sorrow. And if I may add, I think that's why his music is so relevant to us 250 years on.
Because it's so full of emotion.
Yeah, and that's why I hate the term classical music, but that's why our music, if you like, is relevant, because you're talking about one of the greatest people that ever lived, and he gives us so much solace by being able to express all these emotions.
Yeah, David, the 32 piano sonatas are another incredible example of this extraordinary emotional range in Beethoven. And I mean, every one of them is different. And I was wondering which are your favorites and why, and what do they say about Beethoven's importance and meaning to us?
the piano sonatas remind us that Beethoven's really two composers. I know his output is cut up into early sonatas because they show how Beethoven was a dynamic performer. Of him, he was like no performer there had been ever before. Obviously, one of his tricks. I mean, so many of the piano sonatas begin with two little stabs, or and this sort of thing is something that Haydn had never done, and even Mozart only ever did once. And so the young Beethoven was obviously this very dynamic performer. And then the deafness came in, and I think that we need to understand the effect of deafness on Beethoven's character. I think it turned him into some sort of a mystic. And so you end up with these late sonatas, and in between the ones that he wrote as a performer and the ones that he wrote when he was older, there's only a couple of sonatas in the middle. And so that's what I take home from the piano sonatas, that here is a frustrated virtuoso.
It's amazing, isn't it, that such a lot of them actually date from the first part of his life. And I think so often we just think, oh, there's early, middle and late. And actually there's no evenness at all in that. And some of the most thrilling, I mean, I love the late sonatas, but some of the most thrilling, exciting and startling stuff is from the first, probably the time when he was in his late 20s, his early 30s.
Well, the division is at the Appassionata, and after the Appassionata, he only wrote another 9 or so. He'd got to number 23 by the time he was writing the Appassionata. And what a great, I mean, had he unfortunately died before 1815 or something like that, what a wonderful body of work that would already have been, up to the Appassionata Sonata. Yeah. But then, apart from a couple of commissions from Clementi, he changed to this deeply thoughtful man who had been forced into his own mind by deafness.
Yeah. Toby, Beethoven's vocal writing, he comes in for an awful lot of stick for not writing well for the voice. It's one of those cliches that we get about him again and again. Do you think that's fair at all? What do you make of his solo songs?
It's such a sort of emotive subject for me to talk about singing Beethoven. The thing one has to remember is that his grandfather, whom he revered and held a portrait of him on his wall till he died, was himself a singer. And so he must have had some sort of feeling. But I think, as we know and have already said, Beethoven is all about expression, and so is the voice. And I think he wanted to harness the voice to push him to express in words and song to the extreme of its ability. And you're always made to feel mortal when you sing Beethoven. You always get almost to the end of your ability. But you always, when you get to the end of, say, in this case, Fidelio, the Florist and Aria, you can't sing again for a couple of minutes. There's something of like vice-like quality on your being that stops you for a while. And it's the same in other things as well. Everything I've ever sung of Beethoven has this quality of exhaustion about it.
Exhaustion for him or exhaustion for you?
Both of us, I hope. And for the listener, I hope as well. I mean, it's as we've sort of touched on previously, and everyone says, is that he is about extremes. And I remember listening to Tom Addis once about his writing in The Tempest, and someone saying, you know, this is impossible writing, and he said, we're never going to find out if it's possible until I write it and have a go. And I think there was an element of that in Beethoven writing the way he did. You know, I think he thought, I know, I'll write the dots and see if anyone see what it does in the voice.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of complicated, and you won't know whether you can do it until you've written it. Freya, you've written a piece that was inspired by one of the most complicated of all Beethoven's compositions, the Grosse Fuge. What is it about this music that made you want to follow in its footsteps?
For me, looking at the Grosse Fuge was about counterpoint and the way that the lines sort of interact and fit together. But it was also about the sort of the way that it is, you're unable to fit it into any sort of obvious structure or form. It sort of defies categorization in that way. And I think what I found for myself while looking at it, that was because of the subject of the fugue itself, which are just the first 8 notes. The intervals between the notes are in fact a mirror image, not the notes themselves, but the distances between the notes are a mirror image. And this palindrome is manipulated, flipped upside down, turned inside out throughout the piece in a way that you might, if you were studying music history, you might associate with something much later, something sort of mid to late 20th century. But the way Beethoven does it, I suppose in the way that Dougie was talking about, is incredibly emotive and passionate, but also quite sort of terrifying in places. And yet it's this sort of crystal clear, perfect symmetry, which allows him to do that. And I found that really fascinating and found myself using the same pattern of the palindrome, but not the same intervals, to create many different palindromic phrases. And the thing about these phrases is because they are symmetrical but have a shift in the middle, they always sound both familiar and surprising. And I think that's where the genius lies in that piece.
Yeah. That familiar yet surprising is something that's a quality in so many of Beethoven's works that are almost, he's the master of variation. He's always writing variations. And Toby, I was thinking of Untitled Chapter, where the last song seems very closely related to the first, even before you get back to the opening melody of it.
I think of Untitled Chapter almost as a set of variations. So there's a very tight rhyme scheme within the long poem of it, and it seems, the dum da dum da dum da dum, this sort of iambic pentameter of it keeps going the whole way through, and then the rhyme scheme is almost the same for every verse, and there is definitely a sense of evolution during the piece, which you get in variation form. But the curious thing is that when you get to the last 2 pages of the piece, you feel like you've heard the music before, because it's very closely related to the original, almost hymn-like theme at the beginning. But yet you realize on analysis that it isn't. It's an ironed out version and much more lyrical version of what you had, as it was set as a very strophic song at the beginning. But yeah, the essential quality of variation is that it is an almost limitless form in which you can take the listener, keep them rooted, keep them attached to their focal point at the beginning, and then take them so far into themselves, away from themselves. When you look at Opus 111, you can even divine a little bit of a foretaste of jazz in there. I don't know how we, that's just the universality of Beethoven, isn't it? But yes, I mean, he settled on that form very early on as something that he could crowbar so much out of for what he wanted, which was to milk the audience for their emotional capabilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Quick reminder of what we're doing here. If you've just tuned in from anywhere in the world, you will find that you are watching Beethoven Matters with Garsington Opera and the Royal Philharmonic Society, me, Jessica Duchen, and our panel, Dougie Boyd, the conductor, Freya Waley-Cohen, the composer, Toby Spence, the tenor, and David Owen Norris, the pianist. You can send questions at any point you like through the comments boxes, and we will come to them at the end. As we were talking about Untitled Chapter, it's a very personal kind of piece, and it often strikes me that you can't really separate Beethoven the person from Beethoven the musician in many ways. And just staying with Toby for a moment, you were supposed to be singing Florist in Fidelio at Garsington. How do you get under the skin of this character? And do you think there's a lot of Beethoven himself in there? This prisoner, this freedom fighter.
It's very easy to assume that there's Beethoven within it. Okay, it's his only opera. He struggled with the writing of it. He struggled with the first performance of it. It wasn't entirely successful. But yet there are themes that one can dig out of his biography and find sort of universal to all of his music. It is the bare bones of the narrative are scant, let's say, very simple. And I think possibly through his own exposure to opera in Vienna, he realized that that thin poetry can be the mother of very fine music. I think so that's probably why he set himself this story, as well as the revolutionary aspect and the hero. And it was a common theme that he always looked for a hero quality in his music for victory over authority and a sense of revolution within it. And I think you get that in Florist, and but also through the whole piece. You know, everybody is a prisoner except for just a handful of people. The whole chorus are prisoners. And I felt really the first time I went to see the piece that the most striking aspect of it is the first chorus you hear, which is the prisoners being freed for a moment of air and light. And I feel that's a deeply personal moment for Beethoven, where he was yearning for liberation himself from his own kind of prison, which was probably put upon him by financial constraints, appreciation constraints, and also his own deafness, most of all. But yes, Florist, who is liberated by his wife, by his beloved, and by family, and I think that's probably something that he yearned for as well.
Yeah, definitely. And
I can
Dougie,
add to that. I mean, I think it's fantastic what Toby says, and the isolation that Beethoven felt in his life, I think, is also mirrored in Fidelio. And we often see Fidelio as a hope. Hope is a huge part of Hoffnung, is something that comes through Fidelio all the time. Hope is intrinsic to the opera after all the terror that happens throughout the opera. But it's also not only about freedom from tyranny, which is how it's perceived, but I think it's also about love. And that's at the core of the work, and the extent to which Leonora will go to try and save Toby, in this case, to save Florestan. And again, this is something that Beethoven, from what we know, yearned for and never achieved. So there's the isolation of his deafness, the hope for a better world, of liberty, and the things that of the French Revolution, the symbols of the French Revolution that originally appealed to him, and the obsession for some kind of love in his life which didn't happen. And Leonora sums that up perfectly.
Yeah. I mean, this sense of frustration is very striking as well. And David, do you think? Yeah, I think you mentioned the words frustrated virtuoso. How much of this, in the Appassionata, for instance, you get this piece of it is shattered by this chord that comes in, and he hammers on it 14 times. Do you think this is perhaps a sign of frustration? I mean, how much do you think we can judge about his personality from what he's putting on the paper?
Well, I think we can see how much he wanted love by the way that he tried to look after his nephew, Carl. I mean, that was actually a real focus of his love when he No, if Toby doesn't agree.
I totally agree. I think it's such a tragic story. And my heart just melts when I remember that story. Carrying the humiliation he went through when he had his past dug into, and they sort of brought out in front of the court that he wasn't actually an aristocrat and had no claim to be. It was awful.
But there Beethoven was with Something to Love, and he really poured everything into that relationship. And on the other hand, the frustration of things is certainly seen in his treatment of pianos. Pianos needed to be quite robust, I think, to stand up to what Beethoven was doing. I think Johnny's got a picture of the sort of elderly brown piano that Beethoven was pounding away on. And the thing about Beethoven and performability, I was thinking this when Toby was talking about how exhausting it is to sing, is that Beethoven was not a man who made compromises. There he was in Vienna. He was basically doing what Mozart had done, but better, more successfully, except in the one field of opera where he wasn't more successful than Mozart. But Beethoven managed to persuade people to pay him to do what he wanted to do. And so there is an element of, how shall I say, not impracticality, but just not caring about whether it can be done or why it should be done or why he's writing a Missa Solemnis. I mean, that's one of the wonderful stories, a Missa Solemnis for his patron, the Archduke Rudolph, who suddenly becomes an Archduke. And of course, it's never ready, but it doesn't matter because Beethoven's working on his own timetable. With all those things, Beethoven, I found myself wondering when Toby was mentioning about the difficulties of Fidelio and its first performance and so on, whether opera, which is so supremely practical, a performing discipline. I mean, everything's got to get together in opera. And I wonder if it's significant that Beethoven collided with opera in a way which produced those wonderful sparks, but in a way that was perhaps less... well, it certainly didn't encourage him to a second encounter. I mean, his collisions with the symphony orchestra, he kept on doing because he felt that he could still do something there. But perhaps Beethoven's resolute ignoring of practicalities met its match on the operatic stage. What do you think, Dougie? An opera's got to work, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think going back to both what you said and Toby said, that of how uncompromising he was, it reminds me of the stories of the Da Ponte operas of Mozart and how he may have, in some cases, written the arias at the last minute because he wanted to get a really good feel of the particular singer, whether it was Nancy Storace or whoever was singing, that it was for her or it was for him. It was very personal. My feeling is that Beethoven didn't give a monkey's about this. It just, es muss sein. It had to be like this. And I think that the challenges were seen as being, if not unsingable, beyond the capabilities of many singers at the time, even though there was great, I think that historically we know there was very good training at the time. But he was putting in front of people, and maybe Freya will have a view on this, something that's so challenging that we mirror today in some contemporary music.
Hi. Yes, I think it's one of the things that is one of the ways in which he changed the course of where music sits, like where it lives. Does it live in the home in the hands of anyone, or does it live on the concert hall? And he solidified through how hard it is, this idea of it sitting in the concert hall. And therefore, in some ways, I mean, there's a loneliness to it, and to the idea of him writing not for a particular person, but for his own ideas, that persists in how composers are expected to write and be now, and whether that's sort of positive or not. It also is then mirrored in the way that composers often might want to try and push the difficulty, push the performers to try something new. It's definitely one of his most enduring legacies.
Freya, do you get the impression that Beethoven is someone you would have enjoyed meeting in person?
Not really, no. I don't think, I mean, who knows? I think I personally find the sort of guessing what someone would have been like extremely difficult. And I sort of find that for me, the relationship is with the music rather than with the idea of the person. Having said that, when I I have many friends who are composers and I can hear their personalities in the music. So perhaps because I love his music, there would have been something there to connect with in the person. But from what I hear, I don't think I'd like to actually have dinner with him.
There's a quality to Beethoven. I mean, he was very loved, wasn't he? He was belligerent and difficult, but still people found space in their hearts for him. And then people were fond of him.
Yeah, he had a lot of friends. I'm always amazed going through the biography, the sheer number of characters I've been trying to fit into my story. It's incredible. He really magnetized people, and especially towards the end of his life, young musicians, I think, really were drawn to him and were very devoted to him and wanted to help and support him. It's very, very touching.
Do you think part of that is the nature-loving sort of childlike aspect of it? I mean, when Toby's talking about An die ferne Geliebte, I mean, we have birds, we have spring, we have hills, we have clouds, and so on. And in a way, it's quite naive poetry, which Beethoven embraces. I mean, it's naive in its images. It's obviously quite deep in its meaning with the distant beloved. I mean, it's rather idea of declaring one's love. Schubert did similar things, didn't he, in some of his Liebesbotschaft songs and things like that. But Beethoven's way of doing it and tying it all together into one statement, that's not naive. And then, on the other hand, some of the details of the nature writing is quite naive, and perhaps that's one of the things that made him lovable, do you think?
Oh, no, you go, Toby.
Go, Dougie.
Well, I think that's so spot on, David. I immediately start thinking of the Pastoral Symphony.
Yes.
And this, it's not only about nature, but for me, it's about it's seeing the world through a child's eyes. And that is an astonishing concept for an adult composer to do. So it's semi-religious. Well, it's very religious and mystical, and yet incredibly simplistic. It's somehow like a small child saying, "Thank you, God, for the trees. Thank you for the river, for the clouds, and for nature." And it's an extraordinary way that he can go from incredibly complex music and terror, like the Grosse Fuge that you were talking about, Freya, or the slow, the March Funèbre of Eroica, to the naivety of Pastoral, which I suppose comes back to this idea of being able to express everything. I worked for 20 years with Nicholas Harnoncourt, and he had lots of wonderful images and imagery about Beethoven. But I always remember one thing in terms of the symphonic world, where he talked about, he absolutely believed, certainly from Eroica onwards, that each symphony was like an argument between two very close friends about how the world was. So if the Fifth Symphony was about the possibility of freedom, I think, again, and throwing chains away for freedom, the Sixth is saying, no, you can see the world through a child's eyes, and it can encapsulate the whole world. And then the Seventh Symphony is essentially hedonistic dance, every possible dance that can be created, including erotic dances. So there's always this phenomenal contrast in all his music, not least in the symphonies. We haven't even talked about the quartets yet.
We should talk about the quartets. Any volunteers for the quartets?
Well, quartets. No, I've said enough. Somebody else.
Well, I mean, the Grosse Fuge is a quartet. Freya, what do you make of the quartet writing specifically?
I think his quartet writing actually is, in some ways, I would say some of the similar things to what David was saying about the piano writing, in that whereas a lot of composers before him or around the same time are writing things that you could just sort of pick up and play at home, and it was sort of for that sort of context. He was not remotely interested in that, and he really pushes you. I mean, I grew up playing the violin, And when you're playing a Beethoven quartet, he really pushes you beyond what you think feels natural physically and what you think feels like your fingers feel like they shouldn't be going there. But of course, once, you know, there's, again, it's that iron will over the instrumentalist. And there's both, I mean, maybe not in the Grosse Fugue, there's not that much simplicity in it, but in a lot of his music, for example, the harp, there's both a sort of, again, a simplicity and this sort of deeply complex construction within it of sort of dense counterpoint that you almost miss on first hearing because it just is so much part of the whole.
One of my favorite quartets is Opus 95, which is like taking, to me, it's like taking a quartet that is the most complex and epic and somehow putting it into this unbelievably condensed form. It's about 17, 18 minutes long, the whole quartet, and yet it's got everything in it. And you compare that to 131, I mean, it's just astonishing, you know. I think it's his most personal music. And again, it goes back to what we were talking about it being uncompromising. It's about ideas. I mean, he could write a melody if he needed to write a melody. Grosse Fugue is not very melodic. But if he needed to write a melody, he could write a melody. But I don't think he was particularly interested in melodies per se. He was interested in ideas.
Absolutely.
Ideas that perhaps we shouldn't express in words. They're expressed through music, but we can sense what they're about.
Yeah.
There's a couple of things that tell you a lot about the young Beethoven and his quartet writing, because of course his Opus 2 piano sonatas are dedicated to Haydn, and Haydn was his teacher, and of course famously Haydn more or less created the sort of string quartet that Beethoven wanted to write. And so what did Beethoven do before he got to writing his Opus 18 quartets? He wrote several string trios, which are, I wouldn't say they're easier to write than string quartets, but the great thing was that he wouldn't suffer comparison with his teacher at first. He could hone the idea of playing with three-stringed instruments or with several stringed instruments without actually treading onto Haydn's turf straight away from the very beginning. And I think that tells you a lot about how carefully Beethoven thought around all these factors.
Absolutely. I just want to remind everyone who has just tuned in or tuned in recently, you're watching Beethoven Matters from Garsington Opera and the Royal Philharmonic Society, with all of us in our own spaces, our panellists Dougie Boyd, Freya Waley-Cohen, David Owen Norris and Toby Spence, and me, Jessica Duchen. If you want to send us any questions, please pop them in the comments boxes and we'll come to them at the end. I'd like to move on now to just talk a little bit about the question of the anniversary, because this should have been taking place in the middle of masses and masses and masses and masses of celebrations and more celebrations, instead of which we've all been stuffed into our houses and told to shut up because we can't go out, so we can't do very much performing. But Freya, you mentioned something when we had a chat the other day that you felt there'd been a lot of anger in the new music world at the sheer quantity of programming of Beethoven. Do you think that would have been a fair comment? Or do you think he's taking up space that should be devoted to new music? Or is he inspiring new compositions instead and actually giving an outlet for today's composers?
I think both, because I think there's two elements to, or many elements, but two sort of, I'm going to divide it into two elements of the legacy. And one is the space he's given culturally, and one is the actual music and who he was. And I think maybe anger's feels like a strong word. There's definitely a lot of controversy amongst composers about it, about sort of whether that pushes new music out of the concert hall, whether he's already performed enough, whatever that means. I think what's interesting is that there's also this completely sort of counter reaction, which is that, well, yes, of course, all these concert halls and orchestras and opera houses are performing him a lot. He's a composer, and he is the most sort of almost like the archetypal composer for a lot of the way that we talk about what it is to be a composer now. And so a lot of the reactions are also to commission new works by composers inspired by Beethoven, and also for people to actually just write works inspired by Beethoven because they were listening to it more. Although unfortunately, of course, that got sort of cut short. So, I mean, I know I personally was part of a Beethoven celebration and wrote new music inspired by his Opus 109, Piano Sonata. I know you as well, Jessica, were part of it, writing a libretto, or had written a libretto for a new celebration. So I think it's a really complicated issue in that in some ways some of the reactions to out of listening to his music and the sort of creation of new things from that.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, David? Is there too much Beethoven on the piano? Are we overrun with people doing complete cycles, or is there never too much?
Piano sonatas, yes. The new associated board edition of Piano Sonatas has more than 32 in it. They've expanded their definition. So the idea, I once had a student who said, fortunately, Beethoven did not die before he had been able to complete his 32 piano sonatas, as if God had given Beethoven the number at some point during his childhood and said, there you are, Beethoven, get those 32 finished off. I think complete anything is a dangerous thing, but actually, one of the sad bits about this particular year, as far as I'm concerned, is that I'd hit upon a way of doing something a little bit different about Beethoven, because we've come across a set of arrangements, many arrangements for flute, violin, cello and piano of orchestral works. There's a colossal repertoire of them, published in London in the 1820s, only in London, by people like Clementi and Kramer and so on. And so I was linking Beethoven's anniversary with Wordsworth's anniversary and with the French Revolution, because Wordsworth, of course, was actually present at the French Revolution, and Beethoven, at the time of the French Revolution, was playing the viola in The Marriage of Figaro in Bonn, and so they both were doing their little bits for freedom and so on, and we got just a couple of concerts in before they all stopped, and that, I felt, was a way of combining a new way of looking at Beethoven. Zeb Soanes read the Wordsworth poems, and then when you heard the Eroica Symphony in that arrangement, of course not as an orchestral piece, but an interesting arrangement, when you heard Beethoven in the light of a man exactly the same age, talking about the same event that the music was about, it was a new way of looking at Beethoven. So there are new ways besides composing them.
Toby, this continual renewal in Beethoven and this continual expression of new things, that we're finding new things in him all the time. It strikes me that he's a massive figure today for many people through all walks of life, everyone from the writer James Elroy to the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, who apparently is a big fan. What do you think it is that speaks so strongly to people in so many walks of life?
Well, I love, first, before I speak to that, I love David's idea of programming, and I think we're coming into an age where programming can be so dynamic, and we can talk about poetry, we can deliver things not with just the forces that we have available to us on the stage, but contract them, draw the audience in and expand their minds with it, and I really endorse that, and I think that's the way we've got to go for the future of making our music relevant. So to bring it back to just give me a word of what you wanted me to say.
Why do you think Beethoven reaches people in so many different walks of life so very strongly?
The universality of Beethoven is all about, as we always talk about with Beethoven, is the way he speaks of emotion. which is such a truth within all of us. It's a compass point that always brings us back to what we really feel. And he writes emotion on so many different levels. And he can take us to the darkest places, like in the central movement of 132, the A minor quartet, but then also in the same movement lift us to the very heights of happiness and sort of leave us vacillating between the two. It is pure emotion that he drives out of the forces that he has, and also, you know, he was someone who was so responsive rather to the age in which he lived. As I said before, you know, he lived through so many revolutions at the time going on, but in the Northern Hemisphere, all over the world, on either side of the Atlantic, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the American War of Independence, which happened, you know, which was in the 1770s as well. Everything going on in his lifetime, he was fully conversant with man's possibility. And to talk about Wordsworth, I would also talk about the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, and think of The Wanderer Above the Mist, and you know, the quality of silhouetted heroism that was obviously prevalent in the German zeitgeist. There you go.
Dougie, too much Beethoven?
Never. I do think though that from what I've read, that irony was part of his character as well. And for somebody who was constantly isolated and at times thwarted, he probably would have had a wry smile to say, you know, in his 250th anniversary year, of course everything was cancelled. Of course it would be. So I think that's quite possible.
Yeah. In a moment, we're going to hear Toby singing the aria of Floristan from Act 2 of Fidelio with David in his own studio at the piano, which they've managed to put together quite remarkably. I mean, I can't get my head around this at all. It's just brilliant. But before we do that, can I just ask everyone if you've maybe got a favourite piece of Beethoven that sits off the beaten track and that, you know, people could perhaps go and follow up on your recommendation? Hey, Dougie, what would you have up your sleeve?
Well, I prepared one. It's from my former life as an oboist, and there's a little recording that I did with the Chamber Orchestra of Europe wind soloists, oh my lord, about 30 years ago. And we played on this recording, I think you can still get it on Spotify if you want. We recorded an unfinished work, a quintet for 3 horns, oboe and bassoon. One movement was completed, an Adagio Maestoso written in 1793. It doesn't even have an opus number. I think it's got a Hess number, H19. And it's, in a way, the opposite of what we've just been talking about. It's the simplicity and the beauty of it that I would point in our listeners' directions.
Great. Freya, have you got one?
Yes, I would. This is sort of more of a curiosity in a way than a recommendation, perhaps. The Scottish folk songs that he set 25 of them, and he actually, bizarrely, he wrote 179 folk songs from around the world settings over his lifetimes, but these are the only ones he actually gave an opus number to. And the thing that's, there's a lot of things that are actually quite fascinating about these Scottish folk songs. There is a sort of very sort of strange simplicity to them, but there's also an interesting sort of tension. And if you were interested to go and read about them, the commissioner who put together this project had also commissioned KL and Haydn to write folk songs, who's completely obsessed with getting Scottish folk songs recognised. But he was also interested in altering them so that you couldn't have any of the rude words and you couldn't have any of the sort of more folk-like qualities of the folk songs in them. But then he also kept trying to tell Beethoven to make it simpler and easier for people to play, which obviously went against Beethoven's nature. So I think there's a real lesson in meddling with the composer's output there. But it's really fascinating.
Yeah, great. David, have you got one?
I have, yes. The commissioner, by the way, of those folk songs, wasn't that Dickens's father-in-law? I mean, the links between artistic... Thompson, George Thompson, I think it was Dickens's father-in-law or his grandfather. I was going to mention the piece that Beethoven made the most money from, which is his symphony, Wellington's Victory, which he wrote after Wellington had won the Battle of Vittoria. And the French are represented by a tune which Beethoven knew as Marlborough, but which is in fact... that's the tune. And the harmonisation that Beethoven does of the next bit could only be by a symphonist, because instead of going... this is what Beethoven does. And then back again. And I love the idea that Beethoven, even when harmonising for He's a Jolly Good Fellow, came out with his symphonic credentials.
Great. Toby?
I was going to say something else, but I've just remembered another piece that I love, which is an early sonata, opus, the fourth sonata, and the central movement is this beautiful C major adagio. It's a sort of very fragmented melody at the beginning, and then it's a very tender and very pensive and really, really emotionally revealing movement. I'll throw that out there.
Lovely. And just to complete that lineup, my favourite, slightly off-beaten track, Beethoven, is the septet, because it's my happy place, only it happens to be music. And it cheers me up no matter what's going on. I love it to pieces. So now we are going to listen to Toby and David performing the Floristan's big aria from Fidelio. And after that, we'll return and have questions from the screen. Thank you.
Glück von mir geflohen. Wahrheit wagt ich kühn zu sagen, und die Köpfe sind mein Lohn. Ich finde
Wow. Toby and David, that was absolutely amazing. In fact, to be in the room sitting next to the computer with the sound coming right over us, it felt that it really was the next best thing to sitting next to you as you performed it. And I'm blown away. I really am. While you've been singing, while we've been listening to you, a few questions have arrived. And the first one is, I think, for Toby. This is a question from Julie. She says, I remember Toby singing in Philip Glass's Gandhi. So do I, actually. That was challenging to sing as it's repetitive. So how do you find singing that compared to singing Beethoven?
Good question, challenging question. I mean, it's the Glass was about memory. It wasn't particularly challenging to sing technically, but what was challenging was to get the Sanskrit into my memory and to feel secure. And the director was extremely helpful all the way, because what he gave us was geographic anchor points, points where I would sort of trigger my memory as to what was next and where I was in the sort of staging that he'd put onto this Sanskrit, which was, you know, the Bhagavad Gita, which wasn't actually meaningful to the narrative that he was giving it. And so it was gobbledygook in a sense. And we then had to put in almost a mime quality over and above it. Now with Beethoven, when you're singing Beethoven, there are two languages you're dealing with, which is the text and the musical language. And so both work as a mnemonic for each other. I do struggle every time I do Andi Venegalita, because it is so repetitive in many ways. And you think, am I talking about starlings now, or am I talking about the grass? Sometimes, so that poses challenges. But in Fidelio, I don't really have to think about what my line would be next, because it feels very organic.
Great, thank you very much, Toby. Now, the next question comes, I believe, from Romania, from Cosmin in Bucharest. He says, is there something in Beethoven's works that you can put the finger on and say this is the turning point in his creation in particular, and in the history of music in general? Dougie, let's throw that one at you. What do you think?
Well, I'm going to be repetitive, because I think it's Eroica. I think Eroica is a milestone in the history of music, and perhaps I'm symphonically biased, but I think there had been nothing composed on the planet up until that point, both for its epic quality, for as we talked about earlier, how it can express every emotion, and maybe the romanticization of the subject matter, the idea that, you know, being, of course, inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution through Napoleon, to tearing up the dedication at the end. And in fact, what we're left with is, in my opinion anyway, is a kind of homage to the possibilities of what a human being from perhaps very humble origins can achieve. And that's expressed not least in the last movement, which begins with barely a melody. After this cascading, crazy 4 bars of, or few bars of the whole orchestra descending, we're left with a pizzicato. It's an embryo, it's like a skeleton. And from that, through variations we're talking about earlier, this incredible music develops to one of the great triumphant endings. It's sort of the possibilities of the human spirit. Absolutely.
Do any of you dissent from this view of the Eroica as the turning point?
I'd love to add something to that, because what we haven't spoken about is Beethoven's sketchbooks. And I always think it's interesting that Beethoven is one of the few people who is admired for finding things difficult. I was looking at the Fifth Symphony. life as and you can see Beethoven gradually turning this rather banal idea into that very beautiful thing. It started off as a minuet, but I've never thought of the slow movement of the Fifth Symphony really as a minuet. It turns into something a bit more profound. So, if our correspondent in Romania would like to pinpoint something exactly, it was when Beethoven, having been messing about with, suddenly thought, and it's the C sharp, isn't it, Dougie? Don't you think? It's the C sharp, which is the moment that you suddenly think, oh, that's a bit weird. So if you wanted to pinpoint it even more precisely in Bucharest, I would say it's the C sharp, which of course in the recapitulation turns into a D flat, though Beethoven doesn't bother to write it any differently. But I mean, what there is in that C sharp is amazing.
And going backwards, maybe even the first note of the First Symphony, which is in some ways Haydn-esque, but it starts with a dissonance, and he's like,
yeah.
The first composer I think that I can think of that would start a symphony not with a major or a minor chord, but a dissonance, a dominant seventh.
Freya, do you have anything to add to this one? Any turning points?
I wouldn't argue with that, especially not with the C sharp. I think there's something in, and especially with the idea of the sketches in general, that the turning point is in how he worked it out and in how he sort of went back, and rather than this sort of like easy flow of work, actually tore his material to bits to find the thing. I think that's it.
Great. Toby, any others that you want to mention?
Yes, probably for the history of music. I think the Ninth Symphony, the way you have instrumental music bursting out into song, and the way he does it, and yeah, there's the recitative in the cello at the beginning of the movement, and it is as if they are trying to say something, but they're not speaking the language of the audience, and then Beethoven just lets it burst out, or Freude. It's a remarkable moment in all of music history.
And Dougie, didn't Nicholas Harnoncourt have a particular way of staging that? Or am I remembering wrong?
You mean in how he placed the orchestra, or?
No, how he had the singers burst in.
Well, what I do remember about it is exactly what Toby's saying, is that he wanted the cellos to be literally feeling that they are bursting with song. And so there was this, because it's very odd, it writes recitativo ma in tempo, but in fact you cannot sing a recitativo in tempo. So this kind of battle between a tempo and speaking was what he tried to find in it, which I thought he did magnificently, actually.
And then there is a quality in that recitative which has this sort of, oh, if only I spoke your language. There is a sort of leaden, heavy quality, and I really feel that. And it's sort of, you feel at the beginning of that movement, this I want to know what they're saying. What are they saying to me? It's marvelous.
It's as if that's the moment that the new century really begins. And that suddenly you move from one era into a whole new thing that is going to lead on to Mahler and far beyond. And the Ninth Symphony, having been the Royal Philharmonic Society's commission, makes it probably a very good place to wrap up this remarkable discussion. I think we could probably continue quite happily for the rest of the night, but we might pick up some viewers from Vancouver or Australia. We might lose a few here. I'd like to say a huge thank you to our wonderful panel: pianist David Owen Norris, conductor Dougie Boyd, composer Freya Waley-Cohen, and tenor Toby Spence. Huge thank you to Garsington Opera and the Royal Philharmonic Society itself for having us today and for having reconstituted what was going to be a live event as this incredible technological phenomena, complete with aria and accompaniment. And thank you all very much indeed for tuning in. And as Snoopy and his friends would say, happy Beethoven's birthday. Good night from us all.